So today is Palm Sunday, so I've chosen a reading from Matthew's Gospel. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. "Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle, riding on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt, and they placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowds answered, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." These are words inspired by God. So for the month of April, I've chosen as my theme, I would call it the week that changed the planet. And so last Sunday, April 6th, I spoke about Jesus versus Satan, the archetypal struggle of incarnation. And today, Palm Sunday, I would call it Jesus, the Archetype of God Incarnate. So I'm going to cover very quickly 5 topics. I'm going to look at Transfiguration, at Palm Sunday, at Holy Thursday, at the Crucifixion, and at the Resurrection. And then next Sunday, God willing, on Easter Sunday, I'll do a recap of the 2 homilies and open up to a Q&A. So let me say a few words about Transfiguration. We read in the scriptures that Jesus took Peter and James and John and went to the top of a high mountain. It was actually Mount Tabor, which is in Lower Galilee. And it's not that high, it's 1,866 feet. So he takes these 3 disciples to the top of the mountain. And I think it was a kind of, I would call it a dress rehearsal for the resurrection. He becomes a time traveler because he has a vision which is so profound that even the disciples witnessed it as well. He's having an encounter with Moses and Elijah. Now Moses, if he lived about 1,250 years before Jesus. And Elijah lived about 850 years before Jesus. So this is some kind of time traveling that happens. And Jesus' entire body becomes luminous. It's like the luminous soul body shines through the space to itself. And for me, that was another rehearsal for what would happen on resurrection. Now, why Moses and Elijah? So Moses is the archetype of the liberator, and he's the one who gave the Torah when he had an encounter with God on a different mountain, Mount Sinai, that he gave people in the law, 613 precepts of Torah. So he's the archetypal liberator, not just for the Jewish people, but for all peoples who've been suppressed subsequently throughout human history. So that's the representation of Moses, the law and the liberation. Elijah is the archetype of the prophet. And I said to you many times that the function of the prophet is not to predict the future, it is to prevent the future. It's not to foretell the future, but rather to forestall the future. Because the prophet is the person who sees so clearly where we're headed that he wants to prevent what's happening because he knows where we're headed. And so the prophet is the one who calls us constantly back into the covenant with God. And this is not just a covenant that some sky being made with some kind of group on planet Earth, not with a particular religion or a particular group. It is the covenant that every soul mates with God. And so the function of the prophet is to call us back into our own individual contract with God. When we signed up and we said, "Here I am, Lord, send me," that every single one of us, volunteered to come here. We were agreed to come here and to be here now. So the call of the prophet is to remind us, to bring us back into that covenanted relationship with Source. So they're the 2 archetypes that, for me, that Transfiguration represents. And the job of Jesus then subsequently will be, I would say, to liberate spirituality from man-made religions, to move from legalism to love, to move from violence to forgiveness, and to move from a punitive God to a gentle Abba. That for me, that's the function of Transfiguration. So let's move on to today's feast then, Palm Sunday. So every Passover, the Roman governor, in this instance it was Pilate, would come in on his war horse, and he'd lead heavily armed troops from Caesarea Philippi, which was on the coast, the Mediterranean coast, through the western gate of Jerusalem, to take up occupation of the Fortress Antonia, which was a building that directly overlooked the temple courtyard, in order to keep an eye on the rest of Jews. Because the Feast of Passover was a feast representing the escape from another great empire in the exodus from Egypt. And so the Romans were always on tenterhooks at this stage. And so there would be a big force occupying the Fortress Antonia, where they could look directly into the temple courtyard and keep an eye on the Jews. And for the duration of the Feast of Passover, the population of Jerusalem would swell. Typically it was about 40,000 people. It would swell to 1.5 million people. So people would come from all over Israel, and there would be this huge, big tented city around the holy city itself. And so as you can imagine, this made the Romans really, really nervous. So they made a great display of showcasing their military might. And then here comes Jesus, riding on a borrowed donkey in a simple, seamless tunic woven by his mother through the eastern gate, accompanied by a disorganized, noisy crowd, and the only weapons on display, palm branches. So, and sometimes facetiously I say that you could sandwich the entire life of Jesus between two donkeys. The first one, as a little infant, the flight into Egypt, when Herod was trying to destroy the child, he had to use a donkey to escape death. And now at the end, he's processing into Jerusalem on a donkey in order to embrace death. So there's his entire lifetime sandwiched between two donkeys. Jesus' life was a donkey sandwich. Which brings me to Holy Thursday. And one of the things that really upsets me as a priest is that the church has hijacked the Eucharist, turned it into something. You have a male celibate clergy with their backs to the people, muttering in a foreign language in order to manifest the presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. And you can only attend and receive communion if you're a Catholic without mortal sin, and you're fasting. You can't be divorced or remarried or gay, because then you're excluded. I believe rather that every single one of us is a priest, that you were ordained because you volunteered for incarnation. You received the chrism in your mother's womb. The amniotic fluid was the chrism that ordained you for priesthood. That every single one of us is a priest who volunteered to be here now. And so you're quite entitled to celebrate Eucharist in your own home, and you do it mindfully. In fact, I believe that any meal eaten with understanding and with gratitude, especially among friends and family, is ipso facto, it's a Eucharist. So we are not just what we eat, we are how we eat, the level of mindfulness with which we receive our foods. So when I think of agricultural societies, and I go back to my own childhood in Ireland, that every stage of the process was blessed. When we were planting crops, there would be a blessing over the planting. When we were weeding, there would be a blessing over the weeding. When we were harvesting, there would be a blessing over the harvesting. And even when you went to buy food from somebody, there was a prayer over the buying. And then there was a prayer over the cooking, and there was a prayer over the eating. I can still remember my grandmother, Nana, whose anniversary I'm celebrating today. She would bake Irish soda bread, and before she put it over the fire, it was cooked in a pot over the fire, she'd make the sign of the cross in it. And when it was cooked, you'd see it would break open, and you could see the sign of the cross. So every stage of the process was prayed over. And then often there would be a candle lit for the food. And there would be grace before meals and grace after meals. So there was gratitude for every stage, all the ways from the farmer to the cook. And that's what Eucharist actually means. Eucharist is a Greek word meaning thanksgiving. So at the Last Supper then, when Jesus offers the sacrament of the Eucharist, for me, as I've said many times, it's an extraordinary feminine symbol. Of all the symbols Jesus could have chosen to leave us with, on the night before he died, he said, this is my body. So he was giving us a very female symbol, because that's what a mother does. A mother, conceives a child in her own womb, feeds it from her own body and her own blood, and then when she gives birth to it, she puts it on her breast and she continues to feed it from her own body. And this is what Christ is saying. This is what Eucharist is. This is Jesus feeding us from his own elevated soul self. So it's a very feminine symbol. And again, I keep repeating that there are 4 code words that when you see them, you know that you're in the presence of a Eucharistic encounter. Because Eucharist did not just happen once at the Last Supper. There are several instances in the desert and by the lake where Jesus celebrates Eucharist. And the 4 code words always are, he took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed. So to take is to receive with gratitude, not to grab but to hoard the resources, but to take with gratitude. And to bless is not to impart a benediction on a previous inert substance. It's not like the priest says, hoc est deum corpus meum, and that he's taking a piece of ordinary bread and transforming it. The blessedness resides in everything that Gaia gives us. All our food, all our clothes, all our shelter are inherently blessed. So the act of blessing them is a recognition, not an imparting of a benediction. Then the third thing, he broke. He has a mindset of distributing the resources. And then finally, he walks the talk, he distributes. So that's the essence of Eucharist. And it doesn't matter what the food is. At the Lake of Galilee, it wasn't bread and wine, it was fish and wine. The second thing that happened at the Last Supper was the institution of the sacrament of priesthood. And it was for everybody that was present. And you can bet your bottom dollar that there were a lot of women present at the Seder meal. You cannot have a Seder meal without the women. So everybody present was ordained a priest. And there are 4 stages, of any ministry, including priesthood to me. The 4 stages are, there's a need in the community, there's a volunteer who says, send me, the person is given training, and then the person is commissioned by the community to act in that capacity on their behalf. And I don't care what the ministry is, whether it's a bishop, a priest, a reader, a Eucharistic minister, wherever there's a need in the community, there's a volunteer who says, yes, send me. The person is given the appropriate training and then is commissioned by the group to act in that capacity, and instead, then you have a priest right there. And the third sacrament that Christ created at the Last Supper was the sacrament of service, washing of the feet. And throughout Christian history, monks and nuns have carried this forward. Any form of service is the washing of the feet of the people. People who are involved in education, or healing ministries, or hospice care, or even agriculture providing our food, these monks and nuns who instituted these in Europe, they are engaging in the sacrament of service. So that's briefly what I'd say about Holy Thursday. So we talk about Good Friday. And I'm actually going to include the agony in the garden, although strictly speaking, it was Thursday night, but it's the beginning of the suffering. And so there's this agony in the garden that I consider the mother of all panic attacks, that Jesus is having such a panic attack that he is literally sweating blood. And medically, that is actually possible. With such anxiety in the system, you actually can sweat blood. And what's happening is, it's a psyop by Satan. Satan comes and tells him, you've been duped, dude. You've been duped. There is no Father. There was no mission. You lived your entire life, so get out of Dodge while you still have time. So it's the second last temptation in the life of Christ. We had the 3 temptations in the desert when he began his public ministry, and now there's this temptation in the garden to abandon the mission and fly. And tomorrow, or on Friday on the cross, there'll be the final temptation when Jesus feels abandoned by the Father and says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you abandoned me? But even in the distress in the garden, when Judas betrayed him and the soldiers came to arrest him, and he asked them, whom do you seek? And they said, we're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. And he said, I am he. Let these men go. And so the people who would deny him and betray him and abandon him, he wanted them to be protected, even as he was being arrested himself. And then you have Good Friday proper, 4 totally different trials. Firstly, he's taken in front of the high priest, and the high priest accuses him of blasphemy, of calling God his Father. And then the high priest sends him to Pilate. He has 2 encounters with Pilate. First one, there's this alleged discussion between them, and Pilate asks him, who are you and what have you come to do? And he says, anybody who's interested in truth might be interested in talking to me. And Pilate says, what is truth? In actual fact, that was the title of the first book I wrote in Swahili. I called it Ukweli ni Nini. What does truth mean? So Pilate sends him. Pilate hears he's from Galilee. So he sends him to Herod. Herod was the tetrarch in Galilee, but he's in Jerusalem for the feast. So he sent him over to Herod and said, okay, you belong to Herod's jurisdiction. Let Herod make the decision. So he's dragged in front of Herod. And Herod has been hearing about this entertainer for years, this magician. So he wants to see some really startling stuff. And he's the only person in the gospel with whom Jesus refuses to exchange even a single word. Christ stands there completely silent. He spoke even to Pilate. He won't speak to Herod. He's not going to waste his breath on the last day of his life talking to this buffoon who wants to see magic. And so Herod regards him as a buffoon and sends him back to Pilate, where he's tried again. And then I like to take when I cull the four Gospels and I look at the last statements of Christ on the cross, and I like to arrange them what I believe is a chronological order, because this order I impose on it is a kind of a blueprint for the evolution of compassion, beginning with his own suffering, and then the suffering of his family, and then the suffering of the fellow criminals, and then the suffering of the persecutors, and then the completion of the mission and the going back to the Father. So in brief, the first one is, he says, I thirst. Now you can only imagine the thirst of somebody hanging in the midday sun, from his wrists and his feet, what that's like in the parching sun. So it's a protestation of the physical pain he's in. So he's focused on his own physical pain right now. But then it moves on, and this terrible statement, it's a repeat of Psalm 22, where he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? So this is the psychological distress, the final temptation of the devil as Christ is hanging on the cross, that he's been abandoned even by the Father. The possibility he may even have been gaslighted and duped into his mission. But then he shifts his focus and he sees his mother and John the Beloved and Mary of Magdala standing some ways from the cross. They won't be allowed to actually be right next to the cross. And he's wondering what's going to happen to his mother. Now, this is a very interesting statement. So he, nodding towards her and towards John, he says, woman, behold your son, meaning John the Beloved. And then to John, son, behold your mother. So he's trying to make sure that Mary and John are protected. Now, why did he have to do that? He had a family. He had 4 brothers and several sisters, but none of them are there. His brother James was not there, so he had to commend his mother into the care of one of his own disciples. It was only after his resurrection that his own family began to believe in him. The experience of meeting Christ after his resurrection was what changed the entire family. Because we read in Mark's Gospel in chapter 3 and verse 21 that when Jesus began his public ministry, his family thought he'd flipped his lid, that he'd lost his marbles, and they came to take him by force, we are told, because they thought he had gone mad. So the family of Jesus did not believe in Jesus until after the resurrection. And then, and only then, would James, his brother, become the leader of the Jesus movement. But he's not there at the cross. And so Jesus has to commend his own mother into the hands of his disciple, John. So that's the meaning. Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. And then, one of the thieves that's crucified with him berates him and says, you're supposed to be the Mashiach. Get down off the cross already and take us down with you. And the other guy says, look, we're dying and we deserve to die. We've led criminal lives, but this man is innocent. And he turns to Jesus and he says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And now Jesus' compassion is for a fellow sufferer. And he says, today I assure you, you will be with me in paradise. And now he focuses on the soldiers at the foot of the cross who are throwing dice for his garment. The garment that his mother wore from him in a single piece from top to bottom. And they're not going to divide it up, so they're casting dice to see who gets it. And Christ says, Father, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. And then his mission is accomplished. He's now back in total alignment with the mission. And he says, it is finished. It is complete. And then finally, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. But I believe that what Christ actually said was, here I am, Abba, hug me. But his mission wasn't yet complete. We read in one of the creedal formulations that in the time he was in the tomb, he descended into hell. So what in God's name does that mean, that he descended into hell? It meant that Jesus wanted to experience the darkest, deepest, densest separation from the source, a place where some souls are still trapped, not for all eternity, but that people who are afraid to look at the light, are so guilt-ridden, are so addicted that they're stuck somewhere in the lower astral realms. And Christ is going down there to liberate even those, to infuse light, to infuse even that place with the light of Christ consciousness. Because the message he gave was that there is no darkness that the light of God can't penetrate. There is no soul that God's love can't touch. And there is no mindset which Christ's consciousness can't elevate. So then, and only then, I believe, was Christ's mission on the cross completed. Which brings me to Easter Sunday. I like to talk about two different crosses, two different metaphors for the cross. I like to talk about the cross of crucifixion and the cross of resurrection. So the cross of crucifixion, as well as being an instrument of torture, also has a much, much deeper mystical meaning. So when I think about the cross of crucifixion, I see the vertical arm of the cross represents the connection between God's transcendence and God's immanence. And the horizontal arm of the cross represents what Native Americans would call all my relationships, my connection to all life forms on the planet, everything from bunny rabbits to human beings. And then the intersection point of the two is my mission self. This represents my mission, where the vertical arm of God's transcendence and immanence meets the horizontal arm of all my relationships. Therein lies my mission self. And then the cross of resurrection for me is two sets of images. Horizontally, there's the before and after, and there's the below above. So the apostles who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus Christ are trying to convince the audience it really was he. It was the same Jesus we knew, for 3 years. It really was he. He ate fish with us. He showed us his hands and his feet. Thomas put his finger into the nail marks. It was exactly the same Jesus. At the same time, so that's the before-after level of the cross. But there's also something different, the below above, because at some stages they didn't recognize him. Mary of Magdala didn't originally recognize Jesus. She thought he was the gardener. It was only until Jesus spoke her secret, sacred name, and it wasn't Miriam and it wasn't Mary. It was the name of Mary's soul. Only when Christ sounded that did she recognize him. So there's something different. He was able to walk through walls. Somehow his body had transformed. It was the same Jesus, but it was transformed. So that's the below above. So there's we got the cross of resurrection, the before after and the below above. And when I studied the Shroud of Turin, I really believe that the built-in radiation of the body didn't just leave his crucified imprints on the burial shroud, that it also animated the corpse with a new burst of soul energy that resurrected the physical body for the final 50 days of Earth mission. We know from quantum mechanics that all matter is frozen light, and that if you could release the light in a single human body, you could light up a baseball stadium at 1 million watts for 3.5 hours. So this burst of radiation didn't just leave an imprint on a burial shroud. I believe that it animated the corpse with a new burst of soul energy that resurrected the physical body for the final 50 days of his Earth mission before the ascension. It was the same spacesuit, but now it glowed with an unbridled radiance and abilities of his soul self. It was a transformed body that overcame the typical limitations of 3D space, time, and physical matter. So in conclusion, here's what I'd like to say. Transfiguration, Palm Sunday, Holy Thursday, Good Friday. These are not just stages in Jesus' life, they're stages in your life as well. And in order to experience resurrection, you have to experience all of the other stages. And I'm sure most of you have at various times. For Jesus then, this was a week-long fractal of a 3-year public career. And the 3-year public career itself was a fractal of a 30-year life of preparation for his mission. And that in turn, his entire life, was a fractal of the human condition since the arrival of Homo sapiens. So here we have a fractal within a fractal within a fractal. He was the prototype of how to harvest every part of life for its spiritual evolution. And it wasn't his death per se, but his entire life of commitment to the mission. That's what's important here. Here was a man who never forgot who God is, who never forgot who he himself is, and who never forgot who his neighbor is, and who never forgot what his mission is. And that's the purpose of any personal cosmology. Who is God? Who am I? Who is my neighbor? And what is my mission? And moreover, he came as part of a team. And we're all part of the team, like concentric waves rippling out from a divine diamond dropped into the lake of life. So that, who was the team? You had Jesus, Mother Mary, Mary of Magdala, John the Beloved, the 12 disciples, the 72 other disciples, the entire Jesus movement, COJ, and any other community that is awakening to its divine purpose. We've seen in our lives that both triumph and tragedy bring out the best and the worst in us. We've seen this many, many times in human history. People showed their true colors in the last week of Jesus' life. You have the priests, you've got Pilate, you've got Herod, you've got the mob, you've got the soldiers, you've got the 12, you've got Judas. And at the other side, you've got Veronica wiping his face. You've got his mother, you've got Magdalene, and you've got John the Beloved. So people showed their true colors in a time of crisis. Sandwiched between the Passover and the resurrection, or the garden and the cross, for Jesus and for each one of us. My final question then is this: which defined Jesus, the crucifixion or the resurrection? Which defines our community, the crucifixion or the resurrection? And which defines you, the crucifixion or the resurrection? Namaste, my brothers and sisters.